This is the forest pouch project, and we're going to start with these three pieces here. So this is the one that's the shorter of the square bits, that's got two square ends, no curves on that one. And then we've got the zip, and then we've got the kind of rounded single pouch, because there's a one with double on, you just want the single one. So there are numbers on there. You want piece 1 and piece 2. So the first step is to add the zip in. You'll notice the zip is a little bit longer than your fabric, and that's just to make it easier to put in. And also yours is white, not blue, just the white one doesn't show up particularly well for photos and cameras. So I'm going to pop that on top of there. So the zip is down and the actual zip pull is across to the left. And now I'm going to run a line of stitching along there, and then I'm going to come straight back. Now I've sewn this half on, my next step is just to take it to the ironing board and just to press this piece nice and flat. So I'll turn it around so maybe you can see a bit better. You can see how it kind of bows up at the minute. I'm going to press that flat, and if you want an even better finish, you can just run a little row of top stitching just down there as well. Once all that's done, you are going to take your other piece, which will be the lid. Now you need to make sure that this goes, you're going to leave your zip face up this time and pop this on the top, but you need to make sure, let me just move this around so you can see, that these edges are lined up perfectly, because otherwise you'll end up with everything on a little bit of a wonk. So I'll sew this side and then I'll go and press it flat and run a line of top stitching on. Zip's now in and top stitched. The next step is to add panel 3. Now you want to put these face to face, and they should be exactly the same size. Now you'll notice there's a bit of extra fabric on the bottom here. That's because we've been a little bit generous, and although we say 1/4 of an inch here, sometimes people's machines are different and maybe your stitching's a little bit wonky. So what we tend to do is leave that little bit extra on the end, so that once you've sewn them together you can trim that excess off, because this next step is about joining these two pieces here. So you want a straight line stitch along the bottom there, and then you can trim away that excess. Now I'm going to take that to the ironing board after I've trimmed that excess off and fold it right side out. I'm back from the ironing board. I've turned it right sides together and just pressed that seam at the bottom, and you'll notice I've put pins in all the way around the edge. That's because we're going to go around and stitch all the way around this outer edge. Now you want to be no more than a 1/4 inch. Usually we say 1/4 inch on everything, but no more than a 1/4 inch on this, because you're going to add some bias binding tape, and in order to do that it's going to go either side, and if your stitching is more than a 1/4 of an inch past, you'll actually be able to see it on the finished item. So just do that with a little bit of care. Also, one thing you need to do before you stitch it is just pull this zip down, because if I stitch up and across over here, my puller will be outside of the actual pouch. So I've pinned everything in place first, and then I just need to negotiate that puller down a little bit into the centre there, so that when I stitch round I can still get that open. And stitching around the outside will also put an end on either end of the zip, so once you've done that you can trim away the excess on the zip. So I'm going to go ahead and start to sew that now. Just coming up to the zip now, everything's pinned in place so it shouldn't move, but what I will do is when I get up to where the zip parts are, I'm actually going to just hand turn it slowly over there to make sure that I don't dislodge any of my pins, because I really don't want to take the pins out at this point in case this separates or moves. This is exactly why we don't usually sew over pins, because that is actually going to hit a pin if I push it down any further, and that's why we hand turn as well. So I'm going to just move it forward just a smidge to allow it to go either side of that pin. And then I'm right up to the pin, so I'm going to again hand turn to make sure I avoid it, and then we're up and round the curves at the top. So with that completed, it pins out and off to the next step. We're now going to create all the pockets for this. So the bottom pocket you create simply by folding that up, and there are little marks on there to tell you how far up to fold it. And we're going to create a flap for that pocket by taking it's almost like a square oval or a rounded corner rectangle, and folding that in half and popping that into position. You want it about 1 centimetre up from your pocket. Again, it's marked on there, but if you want to move them about slightly, you absolutely can. So that will create that pocket. Now these, obviously we don't want the raw edges to be showing, so we are going to bind these edges, and similarly we're going to bind the edge to this pocket too. So I'm going to make sure that everything fits and I'm happy with the position, and then I'm going to cut 2 pieces of bias binding. I'm going to cut one piece that comes all the way along here. I need an extra centimetre or so either side, and then another piece that's going to come all the way round there. The sizes for these are in your booklet, so I'm going to go ahead, prepare those, and I'll see you in a second. So I've done the pocket and the flap, and I have stitched all the way around the edge, and then added the binding to the top of this one, and just added a couple of pins in because I'm going to go ahead and then straight stitch or top stitch all the way along the top there, just to keep that in place. Now, one thing you will need to keep an eye on is make sure that the pattern is pointing in the correct direction. So you want to add it to the piece this way up. So if that's going to be your feature side, then just make sure that this is the side that is the neatest. And same with your flap. Now this is I've already done the stitching around the edge. We just need to add the binding. Now binding that you've got for this is a cotton bias binding. Now it will come to you flat like that, and then what you'll need to do is just take it to the iron and press it in half. So you need to press it in half all the way down, and then you're going to take that binding tape and pop it all the way around the edge of here. Now because it's bias binding, it should have a little bit of stretch to it, so as you come around those corners you can see it just starts to stretch around there. What I would advise is plenty of pins, and if you leave a little bit on the top corner of each of them, just because you really don't want to just cut that off straight. When we attach it as a flap, what we want to do is have enough just to tuck that over and give us a nice clean edge on the top. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this in place now, and then we'll get them all stitched up. So all of my pieces are prepped now, and it's just a case of starting to assemble. So the first step is to fold that over at the bottom to create the bottom pocket. Now this is indicated on the very, very edge here. You probably can't see it because it is quite light, so you might not be able to see it on camera, but there are 2 little marks here telling you where to fold that up to. Then the next piece will be the flap, and we'll attach that. That's actually going to go on last because we need to be able to bind these edges first, so we'll set that to one side for a second. The next pocket that's got to go on is this one here, so again we'll line that up nice and straight with those edges, and just make sure that I've got at least 1 centimetre above this bottom pocket and 1 centimetre before this next one. So I might even be able to take that up a tiny bit further. Actually, no, I'm going to leave that on its marks, and I'm going to take this one down a little bit, which will give me a little bit more space in this pocket here. So the next step that I'm going to have is just to stitch down either side of this to secure this pocket, and then I'm going to do a little forward and reverse on each of those kind of top corners to make sure that it is nice and secure here and here. And then I'm going to do the same with this. I'm going to stitch a little reverse stitch at the top to make it nice and secure, and then all the way down across the bottom and back up the other side, and a little forward and reverse there. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch these in place. We're almost there with our little pouch. There's a couple of little bits of tidying up that need to be done, which are take all of these little edges off, and that includes any excess that you've got on the zip. cutting those excess pieces away will actually not affect the zipper because you've already stitched both ends, so it's not going to come off, it's not going to be a problem now. So we'll continue cutting the rest of these off and all the threads, and then we're going to bind all the way around the outer edge. So the same way as we did with the little flap, we're going to do that for the whole of the panel. So I've got my piece of binding cut here. I now need to take it to the ironing board and just press it in half so I get a nice sharp crease along that edge, and then sliding it either end. Now leave yourself a little bit extra on either corner, and I'll show you how to kind of tuck those in and tidy those up in a minute. And then we're going to go all the way around with our binding. Once the binding is in place, the final piece to add will just be the little flap that covers that bottom piece. Now you're welcome to put a buttonhole in here. There is an extra button on the MDF panel so that you can add that into there, but it's up to you whether you want to add that or not. You can have it just as an opening flap there. Now one other thing that I did stitch in while I was stitching this pocket on, this pocket was just straight down the side, across the bottom, straight up the other side. But then I also put another row of stitching in once this pocket had been added. Now the reason I put it in once that pocket had been added was because to get a nice parallel line, I wanted to use the edge of this bias binding to slide my foot along and get a nice parallel line with it. And what that will do is when I put items in this pouch here, it'll stop them sliding right down to the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and press the binding, and I'll see you in a second once it's all pinned in place. Now binding's all pinned in place now, and just before I go ahead and sew it, I just wanted to show you one more thing, and that is how to finish these ends off, because traditionally with binding you'd come around the corner and you'd go all the way around, but we don't want to do that because it's going to restrict the access to the pocket. So we just want to finish it at these two ends here. So you can see I've done this side, but I'm going to show you how to do this side. So I'm just going to temporarily remove that pin. I'm going to take the excess of this off to just leave myself about 1 centimetre on the end there, and then I'm going to fold it back in on itself. So fold it in that way and then fold it back in half the other way. So let me just wrap that around the end. There you go. I might need to just pull that in a tiny bit more, but as you can see, that's going to give you nice neat edges. Just tuck that in a little bit. So I need to really take this to the ironing board and press it in place before I start to stitch it. If you have got bits that are kind of just sticking out there, you can always just trim off those very corners so that they don't show on your work. So let's just take those out of the way, pop that back in position, fold it back over, and we can stitch those all the way up. So we are almost there. We have the bottom pocket, middle pocket, top pocket, all with the edges now bound, and the next or final step is to add the flap that goes onto that bottom pocket there, and that's a dead simple top stitch all the way along the top. But first of all, just make sure you've got the pattern going in the right direction, because this is a directional pattern, and secondarily you're going to need to just turn those over so you get a nice neat finish on those as well. So we'll turn those over, line them up. You want them even with the edges, but you also want it about 1 centimetre up from that bottom pocket. So I will line this up, pin it in place, and get the final bit stitched on. And that is our project complete. So this, need to get rid of some threads, but this one folds up, this one folds down. You can put a little press stud there if you want to, or you can just have it as it is. There is a button available on the MDF board if you want to add that there, and there's also a second button if you want to add a button and a buttonhole on this panel as well. So the last thing that is left for me to do is just to tie off some of these threads and neaten everything up.